You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to another episode of SLA Insights. We're continuing the discussion about reading fluency and the different skills, processes, and mental resources that we need for being able to read a text with fluency. I'm in the middle of talking about the various skills that are needed for fluent reading. I've been talking about lower level skills, and in future episodes we'll be getting to higher level skills. The basic principle is that these lower level skills need to be learned and automatized so that there's enough working memory left to engage in the higher level skills. And so for this episode, I'm going to look at the second of the three lower level skills needed for reading fluency. In the previous episode, I talked about word recognition. This episode, I'm going to cover syntactic parsing. And then in a future episode, I'll talk about the third lower level skill, which is meaning proposition encoding. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, word recognition is the most important of the three lower level skills. However, these other two, syntactic parsing and meaning proposition encoding, also need to be automatized. They're also important and are necessary before a student can move up to the higher level skills that lead to comprehension and interpretation. So for this episode, we're talking syntactic parsing. It's also called word integration. And this is the ability to recognize and assign meaning to the syntax of a sentence. And so we're looking at things like word order. Is the word order the typical word order, as in unmarked, or is there something special going on where there's emphasis indicated by the order in which the words are placed? So, for example, in Hebrew, if you put an object first, that kind of marks the object as important, as something that you need to pay attention to. And so being able to recognize those things fluently and automatically without having to sit down and think through it is one of the goals here. Now, another aspect of syntactic parsing is being able to identify and assign meaning to determiners, things like articles, the or a or an, or demonstratives, this or those, and understand how they work in the context of that phrase or clause. Also being able to understand subordinate clauses and how they work, tense, changes in tense, and how that fits and works within the structure of, again, we're talking phrase or clause level here. And these different skills, being able to, one, recognize the form or the word order, and two, being able to assign the correct meaning to that structure, whatever it is. It has to be done automatically and fluently before the reader can move up to comprehension and interpretation. And so the second of the lower level skills, we're kind of building on the previous one. We start with words, this very basic structure within the discourse. Now with syntactic processing, we're moving on to build words and put them together. What does it mean when we have words put together in a particular order? And so I also want to talk just a few minutes about instruction and kind of the payoff, understanding syntactic parsing, what we might do with it in our classes. In traditional seminary training, syntax is often addressed, at least directly, in the second year of language instruction. So Hebrew 3, Greek 3, that kind of a thing. Students, it seems, usually have enough vocabulary and word recognition skills to start focusing on syntax in the second year. Because at that point, they really can start reading the biblical text to a certain degree after the first year. You start getting the whole text. But what if this was part of the first year instruction? What if students were actually introduced to longer texts earlier? An earlier introduction to authentic text would mean earlier exposure to authentic syntax. And of course, they are getting some in the first year. They're translating sentences, reading sentences, they're getting some. But what if we could do a little more focus even earlier? It means introducing more text, more reading sooner. Now, I've talked earlier about how the texts have to be accessible. Students have to know 95 to 98%, that number keeps coming up, need to know that much, that many words in order to be able to read fluently and access and internalize and develop their internal structure and understanding of the language. And the biblical text for a first-year student very often is not that. So what do? Again, in previous episodes, I've introduced some ideas like a diglot weave. And if you didn't see that episode, I would encourage you to go back and see an example of what a diglot weave is and how it works, where a student can access the text and can get authentic words, can get authentic syntax earlier in a way that will help them develop that. Or another option, if you don't have the capacity to put together a diglot weave, is just a simplified text, making sure the grammar, syntax, vocabulary is authentically biblical and authentically Hebrew, Greek, Latin, whatever your language is, but create those texts so they're working with whole texts and not atomized texts, so that they're developing, yes, the word recognition skills that they need to develop in that first year, but they're not just learning word recognition skills, but are starting to assimilate syntax and work with, well, how do you put these words together? How do they come together to form sentences and ideas and so on? So again, today talking about syntactic parsing, the ability to recognize and assign meaning to the syntax of a sentence. And it requires longer texts with authentic examples of syntax to be able to do that. And again, this is often why it's put off until the second year. But if we can start introducing whole texts or longer texts earlier, they can start internalizing it earlier, even if you don't always direct their attention to it. But if you can, all the better. So this is our second lower level reading skill. We talked about word recognition last week, and in the next episode, I'm going to talk about meaning proposition encoding, which is the third and final lower level skill needed before we can move to the higher level skills and start getting to comprehension and interpretation. I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, have a good week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.